The traditional party of player characters consists of brave heroes who oppose evil. In D&D and Pathfinder you had an alignment system that has been a contentious topic for literal decades, and people are still arguing about it online. In GURPS, your character's worldview and morality largely depends on what disadvantages you take. It is absolutely possible to have a character who has both bully and trustfulness, or honesty and bad temper. You can create as complex of personality as you want, without being tied to the alignment system. I have already had a video on this topic before, but today I'd like to talk about some D&D and Pathfinder books about evil characters and evil campaigns, compare them, and see if they can be used in GURPS in any meaningful way. Because every book is a GURPS book, remember? I'm going to talk about 3 books. First, the Book of Vile Darkness for D&D 3.0. Second, Evil by Alderac Entertainment Group, a third-party publisher for D&D 3.0. Lastly, Agents of Evil for the first edition of Pathfinder. Book of Vile Darkness is a rather infamous book, if you are playing D&D 3.0 or 3.5. For the most part, even though it provides many build options such as feats, spells and prestige classes, this is a book for the GM to create NPCs. The section about evil PCs and campaigns is merely a 3 pages long appendix at the end of it. The book starts off with a chapter that describes the nature of evil. It presents 2 approaches, the objective approach and the relative approach. This is only the start of the book, but it already cannot really make up its mind. It says that the objective approach works much better in D&D, but then, when describing objective evil, says that it's all relative and dependent on context and intent. So objective evil isn't that objective, and full of murky gray areas. Then it goes into describing various fetishes and addictions that are associated with evil, a list of quite one-dimensional and bland vile gods, 2 comically edgy races, and some villainous archetypes. Overall, the majority of this chapter mostly focuses on shock factor. The second chapter describes various new rules associated with evil. The majority of them exist in GURPS, especially in GURPS thaumatology. Some ideas in this chapter are actually pretty cool, such as the dark speech, a language of evil deities that has some supernatural properties, the vile damage type that makes wounds more difficult to heal, that's possible to accomplish in GURPS by applying cosmic lingering effect, evil weather, diseases and lingering effects of evil. One thing that always stood out to me is hive mind. It just feels so out of place and I do not understand how it is related with evil energies. Perhaps this is a literary reference to some work that I am not familiar with. The evil equipment chapter yet again tries to gross out and shock you. Torture devices, detailed rules for torture, execution equipment, oh my. Drugs are somewhat interesting, as this topic is often absent in fantasy games, when there are many opportunities to come up with some interesting drugs. Poisons are actually pretty cool. The book introduces a new poison type, psychic poison. This is something you apply to an object or an area, and it affects spellcasters who use divination, scrying and similar spells on the subject. That's a very outlandish concept, but I love it. Material components, yet again, are very edgy, and their pricing is a bit odd. Who knew that the heart of a metallic dragon costs only 7 GP? But pricing in D&D never made sense anyway. The feat section doesn't really have anything interesting. Most of the prestige classes are quite uninspired as well. There are a few that stand out, however. The Cancer Mage was known back in the day to create some ridiculous rules exploits, but the concept of a disease-based spellcaster can be very interesting, as disease isn't something that is usually associated with mages. The Air Priest is an anti-theist priest that doesn't worship deities, but steals their divine powers. I actually have some GURPS mechanics for this class, but I think I'll have to revise them. The Magic section has many new spells and magic items. Also, it talks about what makes certain spells evil, but in some cases the spell is evil because it is, okay? When I was rereading this book before making this video, I read the spell chapter in more detail, and it actually has a lot of cool stuff there. Sure, some spells are super edgy, but many of them wouldn't look out of place in a normal game without all the vile stuff. I will definitely adapt some of them to GURPS. Chapter 7 Lords of Evil is more or less obsolete, as Fiendish Codex 1 and 2 exist, and they talk about the demon lords and archdevils in much more detail. Chapter 8 is mildly interesting. While most of the demons were updated in Fiendish Codex 1, the Shadow Demon was not, and it is really unique. A Shadow Demon forms when the essence of a slain demon fails to reform properly in the abyss. I remember reading it and thinking, if it can happen to a demon, why can't it happen to a demon lord? This is how I introduced the Heliophages from Dominions to my GURPS setting, as a new type of demon lords based on this concept. The Chthons, not to be confused with Chitons, chain devils, are quite interesting. Basically they're a hybrid of a Xenomorph, Tyrannid, Zerg and a Fiend. Also, they are surprisingly similar to the Kruthic from the Miniatures Handbook, even down to the lore. I wonder what's up with that. Finally, the Vath is probably the edgiest D&D monster ever. Finally, we reach the appendix that talks about evil player characters and evil campaigns. There is some okayish advice, but the book doesn't go too deep into the topic. Fortunately, the other books that I'll talk about do it much better. Overall, I consider the Book of Vile Darkness one of the weakest D&D publications. The cover has a mature content warning, but I feel that it goes more for the shock and gross out factor, trying to make evil equivalent to gruesome. Personally, I believe that if you feel the need to include mature content into the game just to make it feel mature, then you are immature. Many parts of this book just seem comically edgy to me, not mature. However, I did point out that there are some interesting ideas here and there, so I'll give it 3 out of 10. The second book that I'd like to talk about is simply titled Evil by Alderac Entertainment Group. Apparently this company still exists, but it moved mostly to publishing board games. Third-party content for D&D has a bad reputation, but when you are playing GURPS, you don't really care about the mechanics being balanced, so the book becomes much more valuable. Just like the Book of Vile Darkness, this one starts off by defining evil. Instead of listing evil acts, it simply describes 3 evil worldviews that correspond to the 3 evil alignments. While it does use some less than serious language, I found the descriptions much more mature and realistic. They just make sense. Each one of these 3 evil archetypes could work for a cartoonishly evil villain or for a more realistic character. Not only does this chapter describe how such characters and societies operate, but it also explains why they do so. Then it goes on to describe various motivations, possible origins and archetypes for anti-heroes and villains, going deeper into the topic than the Book of Vile Darkness did. It even talks about what makes a human villain different from, for example, a dwarven villain, which is nice. The second chapter is full of campaign advice. Instead of a single page from GURPS of Vile Darkness, you get a deep exploration of various styles, themes, characters' ideas, and other aspects of evil campaigns. It talks a lot about how much of a difference makes the evil PCs rank. A game where the PCs are evil masterminds on the top of a villainous ladder is much more different from a game where they are lieutenants or lackeys. There is a plethora of adventure hooks that are short but pretty good. That's what they are supposed to do, to excite your imagination. The mechanical parts of the book, however, do not contain anything interesting at all, but overall this is a very good book that tackles a difficult topic in a much more mature way than the Book of Vile Darkness did, and wasn't written by Monte Cook wearing a trench coat and a fedora. And the advice is generic enough to be useful in any other system, including GURPS, a solid 8 out of 10. The final book that I'd like to talk about is much newer, Agents of Evil for the first edition of Pathfinder. While the first 2 books were mostly GM books, this one is intended for players. First, I have to digress. Pathfinder has a pretty big library of books, but I have never ever seen people discuss the books from a non-mechanical perspective. People always talk about the build options, feats, archetypes, spells, magic items, but I never seen anyone talking about the lore, how one can integrate certain archetypes into the world, and how they would affect it, and the generic advice given in the books also is neglected. I think that's a shame, because I really like how many of the Pathfinder books are written. They have some solid stuff that isn't game mechanics, and I say that as somebody who doesn't like Pathfinder as a system. The book is short, but it talks about what kinds of characters might find themselves serve evil causes, but not necessarily believe them, how parties with mixed alignments can work, what could motivate an evil character to serve an evil organization or cause, and what could motivate a non-evil character to do so. There are many ideas for your character's background, what kind of early events could have influenced his worldview, etc. It explores something that neither Evil nor Book of Wild Darkness do, non-evil characters worshipping or at least paying respects to an evil deity to appease them, or to use granted powers in a utilitarian way. Spells, feats, and magic items are not anything to write home about, but still more interesting than the ones in the Alderac Entertainment Group book. Overall, it's a solid book, and yet again it tackles the topic in a mature way. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. So that's it. I showed off 3 very different books related to a single topic. If you are a GM, I recommend giving Evil by AEG a read. If you can procure a copy. You'll probably have to sail the high seas to do that. If you're playing an evil character, even in GURPS, reading Agents of Evil may be a good idea. The Book of Wild Darkness should probably be avoided, even if it has a few interesting ideas. I'll say it again that I believe that the need to include mature topics into the game just for the sake of making it feel mature is immature. You can have a mature or evil game without long-winded descriptions of gore, torture and sexual violence every 15 minutes. Even I am currently running what can be called an evil campaign, and I will make an after-action report video when it's done. The characters aren't really vile, but they're not heroes either. For example, we had one of the PCs torture a prisoner. I just asked for an interrogation roll and told the player what his character found out. I didn't go into the gruesome details and everyone was fine with that. Remember that everyone around the table should be on the same page, and you should have an enjoyable experience. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.